To use a football cliché, Terrian Saga KR-17 is a game of two halves. It's an action platformer designed with Metroid and Mega Man in mind, developed by Wonderfling and published by Digital Tribe Games. KR-17 makes an early grab for the nostalgia glands, and the first thing I noticed upon launching was the fairly meaty and enjoyable soundtrack, followed shortly by the 32-bit graphics. The 30 seconds of exposition set to questionable story art made it pretty clear that this was going to be a trip down memory lane. Incidentally, as far as bullshit storylines that exist solely to introduce new enemies and areas go, this one disappointingly opted to lazily beat the terrorism horse, having first disinterred its microscopic remains. The gameplay is initially what you'd expect. You play as KR-17, a fairly square robot with a modest arsenal of weaponry including Jim, a happy-go-lucky explosive shell who accompanies you throughout the game and acts as a guided missile. The sprites generally look good, the enemies are actually quite varied, and the battery and weapon selection systems work well enough. Momentum serves a purpose when platforming, and a fixed checkpoint system is used in place of a finite number of lives, much to my approval. The point is that KR-17 started out being fairly engaging for the earliest segments of gameplay, and although I was only just getting into the game, it seemed to be achieving what it seemed to be attempting to achieve. I should point out that I've now realised that the cliché used at the beginning of this review was inaccurate. This section of gameplay represents about a fifth of my experience, with there being two following contrasting fifths, and then a return to the original form for the remaining fraction. As a game of 5/5, KR-17 took a turn for the unexpected after just less than an hour with this robotic spider arsehole and its attempt to destroy this nightmarishly inaccurate interpretation of a bridge before KR-17 can cross it. The successful run looks fairly exciting, but that was only achieved after I'd memorised every pitfall, and that was only possible following a successful recursion of the entire sequence up to the next pitfall, resulting in 20 solid minutes of failure. I was suddenly reminded of Super Meat Boy if Super Meat Boy had insisted on compressing every 5 levels into one level with no checkpoint in between. Before long, other elements of the game started to irritate me as well, like how the sound effects are often obnoxious and drown out the soundtrack without the option to change volume levels in-game, or the apparent pointlessness of collecting the gears littered across the game, particularly when the achievements for gear collection wouldn't unlock. Then I grew tired of the drab environments of the first few stages, and the dash ability, which seemed to exist solely to throw you off rather essential platforms. At this point I was enjoying the more action-based sections of the game as relief from tedious sections of complex platforming, and the minigame where you need to fly Jim through a serpentine network of tunnels at breakneck speed in order to blow up a wall that you're stood next to by setting off explosive placed on the other side, presumably having overlooked the fact that Jim is himself an explosive and also fortuitously impervious to explosions. The essence of my complaint is that as well as being overly harsh on the player by forcing them to repeat lengthy sequences of difficult gameplay from the beginning multiple times, the game suffers when it seems to shift its focus more towards platforming than Metroid-style exploration, a short way into the content, despite not really being equipped to deliver a good platforming experience. KR-17 is a chode-like robot with notable acceleration and a jump wholly unbefitting a war machine with conveyor belts for legs. Equipped as I was with an unenviably inconvenient hitbox and faced with an environment very much designed to encourage a leaping robot to snag its coarse metallic pubes on disintegration fields, I believe that frustration was inevitable, but more prominent was the boredom I felt as a result of the sparse placement of checkpoints. Eventually I reached a pair of more familiar and much more welcome fifths. The level design improved markedly to the point where I was exploring interconnected areas and thinking about how to approach encounters with enemies. The environments perked up and platforming became much more reasonable, largely through the introduction of more regular checkpoints, and as a result, the pace that had been sucked out of the gameplay in earlier sections made a return. KR-17 went back to being the kind of game it was suited to as it had been at the beginning, that being one that is fun. I was decidedly enjoying myself again, up to the point where the game quit to menu and deleted my save file. I'm not sure what caused it, but the footage is right there. There's an outside chance that the developers deliberately chose to hark back to the early days of console memory cards where you could barely store a phone number, let alone game progress, but I suspect this quirk takes the form of a considerably troublesome bug. Do bear that in mind while I bring this to a close. There's a fine line between a game that's firm but fair and one that's sadistically punishing, and KR-17 tends to play hopscotch over it, interspersing entertaining spoonfuls of nostalgia with the occasional section that forces you to stick with a moving platform that passes back and forth through an instant death wall, while unable to see any of the above for a train that will crush you if you land on the floor. As well as its difficulty, the mechanics of KR-17 change throughout the game, with the earlier action-based sections being formulaic single arenas and the platforming sections being particularly drawn out and complex, taking up the first major boss fight. This happily progresses to more action and exploration-oriented gameplay with noticeably more impressive music and artwork. In essence, the less the game tries to break new ground or deviate from the style of gameplay its aesthetic and indeed the controls imply, the more it succeeds in being a comfortable yet lively date with nostalgia, as was most likely intended. For its introductory sale, this game is £3.19, with the soundtrack being freely available to download for the time being. For those with the requisite patience, this game could provide good entertainment at that value, not least because it boasts an extended lifespan at the cost of the sporadic disappearance of save data.